Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to all. I am truly honored today to stand before you and share a little presentation that is meant to take you through, hopefully, an incredible journey through time inside a living laboratory. The Vallée de Mai Nature Reserve is, as shown on the map, it's found on Praslin, our second most populated island, and it is part of the bigger Praslin National Park that is shown in yellow. So Vallée de Mai is only the part in red. And the reason why we are so hugely gathered today is to celebrate the inscription that occurred in 1983, where the Vallée de Mai attained UNESCO World Heritage status. Just to say that the Vallée de Mai was locally already protected by then. So a little bit of context. The nearly 20 hectares of palm forest, it was acquired from a private owner in 1948 by the government, recognizing the ecological importance of the area. By 1966, it had its first legal protection under the Wild Animals and Bird Protection Act. And in 1979, the yellow area surrounding the Vallée de Mai, the Praslin National Park, was designated. And for the ecologists of the room, you will appreciate that that provides a buffer of protection around the Vallée de Mai. By 1989, SIF was mandated with the management of the Vallée de Mai. And the mandate was to conserve the natural life in Vallée de Mai and instigate scientific research for its protection. And I bet a lot of you is asking now, and maybe you appreciated this through the patron speech this morning and also through the videos, what exactly that ticks for the world concerning the Vallée de Mai. What are the values that makes it so important? Because there's a lot of places out there that are indeed beautiful. To put this into context, we need to go way back. And while I was reading up on the criteria that made it that the Vallée de Mai could be inscribed on the list, there was one that really brought back sentiments of the first time that I visited the valley. And this one is reflected very nicely in this quote, saying that the property is preserved as something resembling its primeval state, comparable with the living laboratory. But what are these big words? What do we mean by primeval state? What is that? Why is this important? Well, in fact, if you go to the valley, you have a feeling of looking through a window into the past. It's like everything stood still since a long time. But how long ago? What is the time scale we're talking about? Well, we need to go back 250 million years ago, ladies and gentlemen. This is how significant this piece of forest is. And also for us to realize that the Seychelles Islands, we were not always islands. In fact, we were part of a supercontinent. Pangaea, it was called at that time. And if you notice through the next following slides, the red dot will show you the location of Seychelles in the supercontinent. By 200 million years ago, Pangaea had split. We had the northern part, that is Laurasia, and the southern part, Gondwana. This is what interests us most. It's where the Seychelles was located, very close to Africa, Madagascar, and India as well. In terms of the species that were there, we had cycads, we had tree ferns, we had ammomites in the sea, and we also had dinosaurs on land. 170 million years ago, the Seychelles, together with Madagascar, they started to move a little bit east and south. Eventually, there would be a rift that occurs where Gondwana would split into a west fragment and an east fragment. The Seychelles is now officially separated from Africa. And because of this, it is hypothesized that the movement of species from Africa with the Seychelles was then quite limited. And this has significant evolutionary implications for the species that are found on our tiny islands. It means like much of the species that we have here, they are more similar to species found in India, East Asia, and even Australia, as opposed to Africa. A good example of this is our very own pitcher plant, whose distribution and the distribution of its cousins, if you will, so related species, is in Asia. But the most important and the most dramatic moment for the evolutionary history of the Seychelles, including the Vallée de Mai and the Granitic Islands, started 70 million years ago, when Seychelles completely separated from Madagascar and India and started floating towards its current position. This was during the late Cretaceous period. What followed was what I call a 70 million year long experiment. All the species that were there on this fragment, they then had time to evolve under a new climate, under new conditions, without any predators, with sort of different circumstances. And this gave rise to a fantastic, but really fantastic, and I don't just say this because I'm an ecologist, a fantastic number of endemic species on our own islands. So something that we like to say is that Seychelles, because we often like to compare, unlike Hawaii or Galapagos, very famous islands, we are the only granitic islands on Earth, and we are the oldest islands that exist. What does this mean in terms of Vallée de Mai, taking us back to Poilin and our UNESCO site? It meant that special species like the coco de mer, they could evolve under a different set of circumstances. And there were many syndromes, as we call it, that followed this sort of breakaway, this isolation. Here, as in the case of coco de mer, and this is work that's been extensively researched by Professor Peter Edwards, Professor Carl Fleischmann, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, and others, they showed that a lot of what we hypothesize about why the coco de mer is such a giant has a lot to do with its geographical isolation. One hypothesis is that because there were no more dispersal of the seed, so once the isolation occurred, we didn't have the animals to disperse the seeds, so it didn't need to have a lot of seeds because they would just fall under the tree. So instead of having more seeds, they had bigger seeds, and then they really invested a lot into these seeds because these were low light conditions. And if you didn't shoot for the sky, you really didn't make it. So evolving bigger seeds and also much bigger leaves than the tribe from which the coco de mer was derived from. And because I cannot talk about all the syndromes that occurred from this isolation, I will talk about another one that is the most important, maybe, is that islands like the Seychelles, especially the Vallée de Mai, because of its protection status, have a higher level of endemism. It's like if this coco de mer would say, I am unique, then all the other palms would say, me too, me too. And then you have the bronze-eyed gecko that is like, listen, we really need to finish this conversation because the workshop needs to go on. So in Seychelles, about every fifth indigenous plant is endemic. And to put a number on this, researchers from the Geobotanical Institute in Zurich in 1998, they did research in the Vallée de Mai, and they found that compared to all the areas they had sampled, the endemism was really high, and meaning it had a very high conservation value. You've seen through this timeline now, that there's been several research, mostly about the vegetation, because this is the baseline, really. And a lot of research occurred from the 1980s to the 2000s by opportunistic researchers, collaborators, many of whom are present today, and for that we are very thankful. By 2008, research intensified in the Vallée de Mai. At the very beginning, and to no surprise, we started monitoring plants in 2008. So we monitored the cycle, their phenological cycles, which means their average fruiting and flowering over the course of 1 year, for instance, and we do that every 2 weeks. We monitor species that are important for other animals, but also to have a baseline, because we didn't know so much about our own endemics and our own native species. And this information can then be linked to rainfall, can then be linked to black parrot. If we know black parrot feeds on this certain palm, and we know when they are flowering and in what abundance, then we can sort of predict if there's a delay in the rain, what will happen to the black parrot activities. So it's all really connected. And I don't want to go into too much jargon, so we move on to the next one, the Seychelles black parrot. Or is it? I see a lot of eyes wondering whether this is the Seychelles black parrot. So historically, many experts, they thought that the parrot that we have on Praslin, our national bird, that this was a local form of a species that is common in Madagascar and Comoros. Of course, the Palwina will tell you that this is not really a black parrot. This is the Vasa parrot. Our black parrot that we have been researching in 2006, and thanks to the advent in genetic testing and DNA technology, by 2014, we were able to show that the Seychelles black parrot is a distinct species. It's found only in the Seychelles. And what that meant was the species was listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. So the significance of this listing cannot be overstated, because it changed from list concern, which means the animal is not threatened to extinction, to vulnerable. That means the animal is higher up the scale, the extinction risk is higher. And by doing that, we allow for more resources to be funneled into researching the species, but also in communicating the importance that we protect what we have, because this is the last population on Earth of this bird. So again, the full circle of why research informs conservation, and also the other way around. I will unfortunately not have time to go through all the achievements during the past 40 years, and we have a banner outside that I invite you to consult and to see. But now that we've seen a bit the achievements, I wanted to also highlight the who behind these achievements. Since 2007, SIF has made several changes to the science decision-making process that is in part responsible for an intensification of research activities in the Vallée de Mai. In 2007, the new CEO of SIF was appointed, and she held a PhD degree with research on none other than the coco de mer. By 2008, I recruited a science coordinator with a lot of experience on island conservation and management that set up a rigorous and intensive monitoring program for us to know exactly more about the species that surround us. Together with the site manager, who also had an experience who had a scientific background. They could make a lot of the decisions and guide sort of the research to take place in the valley. 2010, we had Miss Wilna Akush, Science Program Officer. She was based on Mahé, but she supported the team directly, the rangers in the Vallée de Mai. In 2015, Pralinois Vicky Atanas became our first science coordinator. She was based on the field, and she led the research in the Vallée de Mai. Generally, from 2010 to 2023, SIF has been boosting, but really boosting its in-house capacity by hiring more bachelor, master, and PhD graduates as staff and volunteers. In terms of numbers, because we all like that, research that has taken place in the Vallée de Mai at the PhD level, there's been 5 in total, 1 Seychelles, our CEO. Master's level, we have 3 research, 2 Seychelles. One of them is our sales and marketing coordinator, where she researched the local perception of the community on the management of the Vallée de Mai. We have 8 bachelor studies to take place in the Vallée de Mai. Half of them have been done by Seychelles. And part of this is because SIF has a David Stoddard Scholarship where SIF staff is encouraged to study at the environmental science course at UNICE, and many of them have returned to their original place to do the research. We, of course, also supported a lot of international research collaborations, 14 at least, and published numerous papers. Our research team today looks like this. You have seen a preview already, but just to reiterate, it's the biggest team we've had since the beginning of sort of the conservation in Valais. 13 staff, that's really a lot. And they really experience, we have also included in the team 4 members that used to work in Forfait Dinner. So they have experience beyond just the Vallée de Mai. They really have experience. I can say it's the Pralin research team, but maybe I don't call it that. And they also this year, for instance, started the Coco de Mer census that you're going to hear all about in an upcoming presentation. But they didn't do it alone. The research team is assisted by the field workers and the security and other members of the team on Pralin. Here is the first coring, so they're taking sediment cores that they hope will guide us and show us what existed there until the late Cretaceous. So if you remember, it's when the Seychelles started to drift away from everything else. And this work was facilitated thanks to the field workers. But of course, we are not doing it together. I think Eve this morning said conservationists are fighting for your protection. I second that and say that Pralinois and Seychelles are fighting for the protection of Vallée de Mai. So for the local communities and everyone, they've all been instrumental in not only the research, but in communicating the importance of this site to the world. Beyond the past 40 years of research, what are we planning next? So today, the Vallée de Mai is the is the most visited site in the Seychelles, the most visited natural site in the Seychelles. And while we've done a lot to be able to understand the science and the species and the plants, we haven't really looked at the effects and the impacts that such numbers and such number of visitors are having to the site. So the first thing would be to really understand and manage the visitors coming to the site. We also have key knowledge gaps, so layering the different ecosystem, the different species and the plants in the ecosystem. So this is another research gap that we hope to address. And to do that, we hope to prioritize using a strategy that outlines our priorities, because there's an ever increasing demand for research in the Vallée de Mai. And we also hope to extend a lot of our routine monitoring to Fonds Pépé and Fonds Fait Dinocyte. To end, I would like to thank you all for coming. I kid you not, this was the most difficult slide to put together because it's in fact the most important. And as much as I tried, I think it's not enough it doesn't do justice of all the people who's been involved into the research and the conservation of Vallée de Mai. So thank you all. Thank you to the Seychelles, and thank you to the world for all that you do for the protection of this site. Thank you.